This is the lecture for Unit 1, Module 2, COM 431, Applied Business and Professional Communication. The topic of today's lecture is Ethical Communication Behavior at Work, Making Ethical Choices in Difficult Circumstances. During the Summer 2012 Olympics, 8 badminton players were expelled from the games after having been accused of playing their matches to lose. Athletes from China, Indonesia, and South Korea were kicked out of the Olympics for poor sportsmanship. Now this is a question of ethics, and ethics is a system of values that people use to make decisions about what's right and what's wrong, how people ought to act in the many situations in which they find themselves. If I were to ask you if you could tell me whether or not something was ethical, you would most likely say, of course I can. I'm a very ethical person. But not everybody agreed that the athletes should have been expelled from the Olympic Games. And so what we want to start with today is a discussion of some terms that we tend to use rather loosely that have to do with ethics. And once we've spent a little bit of time exploring these terms, I think we'll have a better idea of the difference between values, ethics, and morals, 3 very important elements of communication in business contexts. So the first term that I want to explore for a moment with you today is the term values. Values can be defined as the expectations or goals that we bring with us into all of our relationships. They are the standards by which we measure our own performance and by which we measure other people's performance. Values are ideals. They motivate our actions. Our values come from our family upbringing and our cultural background, and we develop a sense of what is important and how people ought to behave as we grow and mature. Now, while values are individual definitions of things that are good, like, for example, we might value our family, or we might value integrity, doing the right thing even when nobody's watching. Ethics are a system of values which create a moral standard for living. The word ethics comes from the Greek ethikos, meaning moral, and ethos, meaning character. So what we have with ethics is a system of values. We can sort of rank our values with those things that we think are the most important. While for one person, family might be the most important thing that they value above everything else. For another person, respect might be a value. And so, depending on whether or not we rank respect as being more important than family, for example, that may impact our ethical standard when it comes to communication within our family. And morals is the place in ethics where the rubber meets the road. Morals is the principle of right conduct, and here the term that's important is conduct. It's where we actually put our ethics into practice. It's one thing for me to say I believe in honesty. It's another thing entirely for me to behave in an honest manner even when I'm being challenged. It may help to explore some things that ethics is not. So for example, ethics is not the same thing as feelings. While feelings can provide us with important information as we're making our ethical choices, sometimes our feelings can cause us to not be comfortable doing the right thing if the right thing seems to be too hard. Likewise, some people have really highly developed habits that make them feel bad when they're doing something that they may believe is wrong, but many people can feel good even when they're doing something they know they shouldn't. At the same time, ethics is not the same thing as religion. Many people are not religious, but ethics applies to everyone because everyone, whether religious or not, has a sense of the way people ought to behave and an idea about the way that people should conduct themselves. Ethics is not simply following the law. A good system of law does incorporate many ethical standards, but the law can sometimes deviate from what is actually ethical. Ethics is not simply following culturally accepted norms. Some cultures have highly developed codes of ethics, but other cultures can become very corrupt or even blind to certain ethical concerns. when in Rome, do as the Romans do is not a satisfactory ethical standard. And finally, ethics is not the same as science. Social science can provide important data to help us make better ethical choices, but science alone can't tell us what we ought to do. Just because something is scientifically or technically possible does not make it ethical. Now, there are two fundamental problems that everyone faces when they're trying to identify the ethical standard that they wish to follow. And the first is that we need to have a base or a foundation for our ethical standards. And the second question that we face is, how do we apply those standards to specific situations we may face? So if we're not simply basing ethics on our feelings or religion, the law, accepted social practice, or science, then what do we base them on? Many philosophers and ethicists have helped us to answer this important question. They suggested that there are at least 5 different sources of ethical standards that we can use. These 5 different approaches to ethics include the utilitarian approach, the rights approach, the fairness or justice approach, the common good approach, and the virtue approach. Now, these different approaches may not all answer the question, what is ethical, in the same way. Nevertheless, each approach gives us important information that can help us determine what is ethical in a particular situation. And much more often than not, the different approaches do lead to similar answers. The utilitarian approach addresses the consequences of an action that we may be considering. Some ethicists emphasize that the ethical action is the one that provides the most good or does the least harm. To put it another way, you can think of this as the approach that balances the greatest amount of good over harm. In the corporate world, an ethical corporate action would be one that produces the greatest good and does the least harm for everyone affected, including customers, employees, shareholders, members of the community, and even the environment. So the utilitarian approach is dealing primarily with consequences, as it tries to both increase the good that is done and to reduce the amount of harm that is done. Some philosophers and ethicists have suggested that the ethical action is one that best protects and respects the moral rights of people who are affected. This approach starts from the belief that humans have a dignity based on their human nature and perhaps on their ability to choose freely what they do with their lives. On the basis of our human dignity, we have a right to be treated as ends, not merely as means to some other end. There is a very interesting book called Where Am I Wearing? We're going to look at a little video clip from that. And it all kind of ties into the idea that we purchase our clothing in American stores that is produced in many different countries around the world. And there's a question about whether or not people who produce our clothing are having their human dignity protected. And so this would be a situation in which the rights approach might be applied. Aristotle and other Greek philosophers contributed the idea that all equals should be treated equally. This is often referred to as the fairness or justice approach. Today we use this idea to say that ethical actions are those actions that treat all human beings equally, or if we treat people unequally, then at least we treat them fairly based on some standard that is defensible. For example, we pay people more based on the fact that they work harder, or the amount of education they have that may be greater, or because of the greater amount that they contribute to an organization, and we think of that as fair. But there is a continuing debate over CEO salaries. Is it fair to pay someone hundreds of times more money than you pay someone else who works in the same company? Many ask whether this huge disparity is based on a defensible standard, or whether it's the result of an imbalance of power that is inherently unfair. Some Greek philosophers also contributed the notion that life in community is a good in and of itself, and that our actions should contribute to that life. The common good approach suggests that the interlocking relationships in society are the basis of ethical reasoning, that respect and compassion for all others, most particularly the vulnerable, are requirements of such reasoning. This approach calls attention to the common conditions that are important to the welfare of everyone. And this is the approach that's often used to support the establishment of laws, police and fire departments, healthcare, public education, and even public recreation as a good that we share together in community. A very ancient approach to ethics is the virtue approach. And this is based on the idea that ethical actions ought to be consistent with certain ideal virtues that provide for the full development of our humanity. Virtues are defined as dispositions or habits that enable us to act according to the highest potential of our character and on behalf of important values like truth and beauty. Some examples of virtues include things like honesty, courage, compassion, generosity, tolerance, love, fidelity, integrity, fairness, self-control, and even prudence. Virtue ethics asks of any action, what kind of a person will I become if I do this? Or, is this action consistent with my acting my best? Now, as we're making decisions, it's important to have a method for making ethical decisions so that we are sure not to avoid or bypass any important elements in the decision-making process that could prevent us from making a good ethical decision. Here is one such framework for ethical decision-making recommended by the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. It involves 5 basic steps. The first step is to recognize when you're facing an ethical issue. Maybe you're making a decision that could be damaging to some individual or to members of a particular group. Perhaps you're making a choice between a good and a bad alternative, or maybe you've got 2 goods or 2 bads that you have to select from. Perhaps you're facing an issue that's more about what's legal or efficient, or perhaps there's more at stake than just that. Once you know that you're facing an ethical issue, it's important to get all the facts so that you're clear about what the implications would be of the various decisions that you might take. Once you have the facts about your particular situation, it'll be time to evaluate alternative actions you could take. You could ask yourself which option would produce the most good and do the least harm, taking the utilitarian approach. Or perhaps you would consider which option best respects the rights of all of the stakeholders. That would be the rights approach. Or perhaps you would consider the option that would treat people most equally, or at least the most proportionately, using the justice approach. The common good approach would lead you to ask which option best serves the community as a whole rather than just some members. And the virtue approach would cause you to ask which option would lead you to act like the sort of person that you want to be. Once you've evaluated those alternative actions, it's time to make that decision. A good way to test the decision you're considering is to ask yourself, if I told someone that I respect, or perhaps just told a television audience which option I've chosen, what would they say? And then finally, it'll be time to act. Once you've acted, you should take some time and reflect on the outcome. And that takes us to time for you to reflect on the remaining elements in Module 2. See you in Module 3.